comments from series focusing on school planning and design for COVID-19. And today's webinar is hosted by Nassau BOCES and the Long Island chapter of the American Institute of Architects. It's titled Next Millennium Design, Adapting to Emerging Variables. So for those of you who attended the last webinar 2 weeks ago, we're happy to have you back. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'd just like to take a moment to quickly summarize the concept behind the webinar series. So please bear with me for a moment if you've heard this before. This series provides an opportunity and a forum for design professionals and the educational community to work together to evaluate and enhance the physical school environment that we're currently providing for learning. This has become even more important more than ever following the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we've assembled some excellent presenters over the course of the 3 webinars. They all come to us with impressive credentials and experience in dealing with the issues that we're facing today. So we're very thankful to have them share their insights and their perspectives on the future of school planning and design. But along with these presentations, it's just as important for us to hear from all of you. You are the primary stakeholders in education, so your voice is critical in this discussion. Together, we can examine the opportunities, the strategies, and the challenges ahead in redefining the physical school environment. We can also begin to develop solutions and new educational learning models that could in fact impact school design for many years to come. So these are the primary goals that we hope to accomplish in this webinar series. In advance of today's presentation, we had sent you a virtual thought exchange question, and our presenter will share those responses that we received to date. We're also going to leave that thought exchange open until the close of business this coming Friday, so that those of you who did not get a chance to participate will have the opportunity to do so. So before we close out today's session, we'll provide the thought exchange information to all of you so you can join in this important conversation. So before we begin today's presentation, I would like to invite Dr. Robert Dillon, our District Superintendent for Nassau BOCES, to share his thoughts. Dr. Dillon?
Thank you, Tony. Thank you very much. I'd like to not only thank but congratulate Tony, his staff, the committee who put this together. The last webinar was outstanding, very interesting and informative, and I'm sure this will be equally as well, if not better. You know, I was reviewing the learning goals for this particular presentation, and the one that resonates with me personally the most was number 4. Have a better understanding of how the built environment can help promote student engagement and provide for student-based learning by allowing for a stable yet flexible, comfortable yet purposeful sense of place to want to come back to, a place to thrive and grow, a community of place. Well, from my perspective, given what we are currently experiencing with the pandemic, with our hybrid, remote, and partial in-person learning, I think it's never been more important that the people who create and build our facilities and plan our facilities and learning places need to understand more than ever the need for flexibility and comfortable and a sense of purpose and place. I don't think it's never been more important as we move forward. And much is unknown, but I'm confident with the intellectual capacity of those here present today for this webinar and those with whom we work, we'll get through this. And again, thank you for joining us. And I thank Tony and the committee for putting this together, and have a great webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dillon. Next, I'll turn it over to Graciela Carrilla, the president of the Long Island chapter of the American Institute of Architects, to introduce today's speaker. Graciela?
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Dr. Dillon, for your words. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our event. I'm very happy to collaborate with Nassau BOCES on this incredible lecture by Kevin Walsh. Kevin Walsh AIA, ALEP, lead AP, is a licensed architect and partner with BBS Architects, landscape architects, and engineers with more than 25 years of diverse experience in visioning, planning, and designing public and private schools. university buildings, hotels, public libraries, and most recently, a 100-bed campus for addiction treatment and research on the East End of Long Island. Kevin has been certified as an accredited learning environment planner by the Association for Learning Environments. ALEP principles apply to many project types since people, connections, and community are central to the successful design of places where people learn, work, and play. After the presentation by Kevin, we will have some time to respond questions. Please send them over through the Q&A box that you see on the screen at the bottom. If we run out of time, we will respond them separately. And we are recording this webinar. We will be posting this webinar on our websites and YouTube account, as well as with the questions that we will respond after the event. So no further ado, Kevin, please start your presentation. Thank you.
Very good. Share my screen. Okay, so we swapped screens. So thank you all for having me today. So we'll start with, as Tony mentioned, Thought Exchange had started a dialogue with folks for this and kind of developed a word cloud based on some of the things people said. Also, there were some questions that had been asked about, you know, what type of folks do we have here? So we have a good amount of people from the educational community and then some other folks is here as well. You know, I think to set up the presentation is a couple questions. One is, do you think we should all be 100% back in school or some combination? We have the 50-50 hybrid and then nothing. Obviously, people don't think the 25% is a good idea. And some people are still not sure. Overwhelmingly though, people really believe that school buildings are capable of being adapted. And that's good news. Lots of investment over time by communities and school districts in schools. So with that, I'll move right into the presentation. Let me just move this. So next millennium design, you know, we've heard, I think, about 21st century design, next gen, a couple other terms. This term builds upon those and includes what's happened most recently into the mix, adapting to emerging variables. This is an ongoing process. The numbers at the bottom seem linear, but we also know that those numbers, it's not a linear process. There are no right answers at the moment. This is really about sharing thoughts and ideas for how to move forward. Just to get into the words of this, you know, adjusting to new conditions, repurposing, rethinking, dealing with prominent emerging changes that are varying. So again, it's a very dynamic process, and I want to reinforce the process aspect of this, the connections of people communicating, learning from each other, and working together to move forward. So I am a licensed architect. I just put the date stamp on here because I think it's important. Today's October 14th. This presentation might be different in a week or a month, but it's important. And every so often, every few days, every few weeks, we're all developing. I'm also a learning environment planner. You know, and sometimes the architect and the planner don't see eye to eye. It might be tough for me, but I'm doing both, right? Architect wants to draw everything and start designing. The planner says, hey, wait a minute, you know, just hold on. Let's figure this out. Let's hear what everybody has to say. Let's get together. Let's get consensus, and then let's move forward. Managing change. Here we are. We're all managing change everywhere, not just at school. This impacts all levels of society. And here's Jeremy, my son, and is just, you know, Asher, our grandson, born in April, right in COVID. And we haven't gotten to meet him yet because he's in Texas and we have travel restrictions from New York. But just a sense of a work phone, a home phone, a baby, and mom's shopping somewhere. So this is a new work day. Back to planning, right? So, you know, sometimes we expect things, you know, in this case, the 4 seasons, and then obviously there are unexpected moments. So proposing, you know, take this moment and switch out of survival mode into panic. I think people already are, and restart the work on long-term planning. And that's what we need to kind of do, is gather up. So through the presentation, we're going to try to show examples of ideas or things to think about and certain basics to not forget. So today's pre-K-12 moment, I think we can all agree, is mixed with anxiety and hope for relief, and really to come together. And before we start building things, we need to work on awareness, mindfulness, empathy towards others. And I think there's recovery going on. I think we all know that. And has brought people together more than it has not, I think. To know the difference between empathy and sympathy is very important moving forward. You sponging it, becoming part of it with someone, or you just kind of feeling sorrowful about their misfortune. It's not very helpful. So it's important to distinguish and be mindful of these kind of interactions between people. So here I just wanted to give a behind the scenes look at how all the very different components of students, teachers, buildings, and an overall vision might come together. It's a lot of bubbles. It's a big chart. I'll say, just to let you know, the building is in purple, students are blue, teachers are in green, and they're all swirling together into this matrix here. I made a simplified version here of how vision cuts through, and then the teachers, students, and the building interact along the way with a vision, and that the school can be a stabilizing element for a lot of students. So let me just quickly go through some of these relationships so you can see we start up here with a very conscious and thoughtful start to long-term planning, and move through kind of the abstractions, education, space. Obviously, we'll travel down through space into the building, but for the moment, let's head to the right to students and teachers and how they interact. Again, we get all involved in curriculum, schedule, things that administrators do, professional development, pedagogy. You hear that a lot in terms of how teaching is delivered and how students interact with all that. And teachers and students can flip-flop positions. We're all students at the moment, I would say. And moving through the process of learning, sometimes through interaction with other folks, sharing, making connections, traveling through empathy, respect, and trust to a sense of the learning community. And then back into the building. So virtual technology is a way for this that's happening, obviously remotely now, but the building responds with a variety of classrooms, breakouts, in between zones, visibility. So there are learning communities at many different levels, both physical and non-physical. And that the building over here is a support vessel for all of this activity. So as you move through, you see how things cross over. Students come down, you're trying to help them develop themselves, student-based, right? Everything else is in support of that. The students are the star here. And that through mindfulness, wellness, they might even go through citizenship and an awareness of safety and security as a safety protocol within the school that fuses with technology, the built environment, systems, emergency preparedness, all that type of stuff. Ability to focus as we come down, the students are coming down towards their goal of pushing beyond known limits and being independent at the end of this, that they're exploring. I'm gonna jump into that. Red as the building has a sense of spatial purpose. It's adaptable, flexible. Furnishings help that. The fact that students and teachers can manipulate. So I think all the aspects we talk about a lot with the 21st century design, what does it mean? And now next millennium, how do you keep the best of what we did? How do these things all relate? Down here, student ownership and leadership. Ownership of space, it's their space. It should be their sense of community at school. And that peer support, personalization of that. It leads them over here. I'm gonna go back to the building. Through architecture, aesthetics, and image can help develop a sense of pride even in the student. Again, I want to kind of come back. Now, the architect, the materials, color, texture, zoning of private, semi, all these different things that we're doing. All these things are going on at the same time in a school. So it's a lot, but it's important. And there's only one chart like this. We move through color, texture, eliminating visual noise, decluttering, which is a really good thing that's been happening lately. Biophilic design, I'll get into that. It's a little more natural, effortless feeling that students can feel comfortable to just open up and engage, that they're not closing down or being stressed or isolated. I think that's a big moment for us right now, and that buildings can adapt and flex and incorporate design elements that help that happen and reinforce the positive experience. Back to exploration, opportunity, discovery, ability to work alone or in groups, and eventually that students are prepared to be lifelong learners. So we leave that. I think this is just a very good foundational diagram for a lot of things we're going to talk about. And it's all about connections. That chart is all about connections between people, buildings, places, expectations, etc. All with community thread through it. So that's really the intro. Here's the layout of what the presentation is going to be today. So we did the overview. We'll talk about where we've come from before 2020. The core of what we want to talk about is student-based learning and active student engagement. The abrupt challenge to everything this year. And that take this moment now as a long-term planning opportunity. So that as we move forward with new and existing school design after this, we incorporate the best of what we have and don't lose it. But, and don't forget the basics. You know, we still have infrastructure, the roof can't leak, and we need to look at our HVAC systems and all that type of stuff. How to adapt, thoughts about that, and then ultimately a summary of what the presentation is. Okay, so you know where we are. So before 2020, right, back to the one-room schoolhouse, you know, I'll just start in 1900 and move, you know, housing students was the main event, you know, the beginning part of the 20th century. And I have a picture in 1950 that might actually have been taken in 1985 or 1990, but it's the idea that everything was just ordinated. And over time into 2019, we really had moved forward and taken a look at different ways to accomplish that. And education really had developed, the delivery of education. Here's a big map of things in time, really from a New York point of view, maybe Northeast a little bit too. I just wanted to say that, but starting on the back here on the, I think I have a pointer. Back here at, 1900, the one-room schoolhouse after the Industrial Revolution, right? The students needed to go to school, like they weren't working anymore, and that's a good thing. And by the 20s and 30s, you had more kids. The schools started to become 2 and 3 stories. We know a lot of these around. They have a main office on the 2nd floor, lots of idiosyncrasies to them. And post-war, World War II, things sprawled. Suburbia, just buildings going on and on and on at great speed and potentially with lower budgets because things were happening so fast. And another period, 60s to the 80s, where some experimentation, more than what had happened previously, open plans, certain ideas of this and that, bit of a backlash in the 80s to that. And then the age of technology, computing involvement, ADA, the internet in the 90s, and into the 2000s, right before. And now here we are in 2020 looking forward. So I just wanted to say one of the important parts of this slide here, get rid of that. A little issue here with the pen. Okay. Sorry. Moving forward. All right, technical difficulty. We'll get rid of that. Okay, good. So you still have districts that may have a one-room schoolhouse. You have some that have artifacts through into the 40s and 50s, even today, and how those buildings were thought of at that time, competing with today's delivery of education. You have some that have a collection all the way back to the 20s through some of the evolution and backlash of some of the big ideas of the 60s and 70s. Some have moved into the 2000s as along the way with the 21st century, but they may still have a few throwbacks from the 20s. And it does lead to equity issues in terms of how these buildings can be used. Different elementary schools within the same district might have different opportunities because of the space they have. So how can we bring those together and make that an equitable facility? And the challenge of next millennium is, well, we'll find out, right? That's what we're here to talk about. And just some levity. I mean, older buildings fight back. They don't want to be changed. They're set up in a certain way. So, but with persistence, we can certainly operate on them. So the main portion of the program here, just setting up before we start designing anything, student-based learning and active student engagement. I call it a joint venture, the architect and the planner again, because sometimes these folks are at odds, but It's not about being at odds anymore. This is all about all the different facets, this team plus 10 more getting together and moving forward. Student-based learning is, again, it's the focus of what we're doing. And each student has tremendous potential in a variety of ways. I just love the word pluralism because there's so much going on with each one of us, each student, and that's the point, to try to manage and focus and not keep contained. Let it out, let things spread together. And how does the space ultimately help that out? Student engagement, you want to get kids in, you want them to be excited, you want them to come back, you want them to open up and engage with what's going on, not just within themselves, but with others, and to truly grow. And really the thought for the building and the built environment is just don't get in the way, right? It's not the building for the building's sake. It's the building for the sake of student engagement. One of a couple quotes in a serene view of Jones Beach, South Shore, Robert Moses Beach, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and just talking about intelligence plus character. It's good to learn things, but it's also good to understand, the big word empathy, and understanding where somebody else is in their place and in a way of bringing us together. So a couple tools coming over next in a few slides, things to think about. We know this, I've been saying it already. No people are the same. We have different motivations. We have different strengths, learning styles, background, culture, language, home life, everything. The three up top, analytic and global, are very general ideas to explain personality types. And sometimes these folks, they may not think they like each other, but it's just because they're not speaking the same language. Analytical is always and global is looking at the whole big picture, and you need the integrative person to pull it together. So interesting dynamic just of people, not just students. It can be a student and a teacher. It can be teachers. It can be community groups versus the school district, all of it. And some people are impulsive. It has to be done in 12 seconds or less. Other people want to take a little time to think about it. So you can see there are obviously conflicts going on that you try to smooth out and get everyone to engage and be together in the same place, and kind of turn them into opportunities. People feel stressed differently. They take it in differently. And over time that generates anxiety. So we have all this to deal with at the moment, and you have that as a dynamic within a classroom, within a school anyway, and it's just now heightened by what we're dealing with. So now getting to learning styles. Again, these are some basic 6 of how different people learn. And by addressing these styles within a person, some people start out stronger in some than others, and then you work to develop all of them. This is how a classroom can be modified to have, or a building, a whole building, to address these specific areas or try to combine them to help people learn and grow. So we'll just start with auditory. Only 15% of the population actually learn just by listening, right? So if you just are sitting and listening and have a whole classroom of people just, sitting there, most people aren't getting it. Then you have visual picture. It's right here again. It's you see the image. It helps you learn. Seeing the words, right? I try in this presentation even to show different styles in the graphics to engage you guys. Learning styles, tactile, just a sense of touch, just doing things instead of sitting and being inactive. Kinesthetic, a little bit more moving around, kind of, larger movement to help imprint memory and do things. And auditory verbal, the people who have to kind of talk out loud in the middle of the lesson, even to themselves, and then answer the question before somebody else has anything to say. That's what they need to do to try to reinforce what they're learning. So as a generalization, younger students start out here, move forward into visual, auditory catches up a little bit later, and eventually, you have a more well-rounded sense of learning styles, and you can kind of move around, and that's kind of the complexity of the experience to try to touch all of these. And some people hang on maybe more, they're very strong tactile and kinesthetic learners, and sometimes they're left behind, but in truth, they have a strong intelligence here. We just need to address it somehow and help them move forward. Many become entrepreneurs, move on, and just create their own lives after, but we could learn from them along the way. I just added a couple that maybe are others, we want to talk about even some relevant topics, like what about a student who's home, I don't know, learning virtually and has a hard time actually relating through a keyboard or a mouse or a finger pad and really just wants to draw on a piece of paper, or is intuitive about the people around them in a group and learn through gestures and eye contact and behavior that they don't have access to when they're looking at a screen, just whether it's in school or at home in terms of the interaction with technology. Just something to think about. Learning style zones, like I was saying before, that the school building can adapt into zones of this and various rotations of either kids or teachers. I think at the moment, more for cohorts to stay together within the world we're in at the moment, the teachers would probably rotate and differentiate, keeping the kids together within cohorts. Elementary schools versus secondary, elementary is more classroom to classroom with some breakouts, and in secondary, kids are moving a lot more. So it just would follow that pattern in its development. Differentiated instruction is now the teacher responding to the different types of learners, understanding it, identifying it, and then finding ways to build up all of the various students to help them all be as well-rounded as possible. Again, same thing. There's a lot of variety here and it's not necessarily linear. So it's a lot more to choreograph, but it's where we're heading, and that's what professional development helps as well. And I'm going to suggest later that if parents are acting as teachers, then we may need some parent professional development as well, and maybe somewhere in the school that can happen. Talk about that in a minute. Just touching on this again, just surface. There are theories about multiple intelligences, and also people are at a different level of readiness to work and participate, right? And then there are things that may hold them back. Pretty interesting concept by Albert Einstein that you can learn combinatory play. You take things that don't really make sense together, you play around with them, you try to find relationships, and all of a sudden you discover something that you didn't see coming. And I think that this is a very interesting tool, vehicle to learn. It leads to project-based learning, which is then you're actually building something and learning about that, or maybe you're playing different roles in an historic event that you have to learn both sides of the story and then perform it in a sense, or have the debate about it. And that active learning in general is all about thinking, doing, planning, connecting, engaging. And that there's motivation through that activity and it's rewarding. So it's something to feed on. So just a couple photos, more traditional sense of building things. Here, like kind of a courtroom situation. Here, a broadcast. I want to emphasize this, that I think this has tremendous opportunity in terms of all kinds of activities moving forward, remotely or in school, or the preparation of broadcasts by students or teachers within the school, within other buildings, within parts of the school, whatever it is. I think it's an important type of space, that it's multifunctional. Things just move around, not as much built in, things move around. Building projects together, discussing and figuring out problems together. Again, the project-based, more dramatic, theatrical things, go again, role playing. And then what we all think about kind of robotics and some Lego and whatever else that are certainly understood as projects. So I won't read this, but the idea that to adapt to all those activities, you have different kinds of environments to do that. And so that's what we're talking about. And I'm just going to say, you don't always know or can plan for what students are going to do. So here's a place where this student really wanted to be to work on their laptop. So, choose a place to go and go. And again, just the idea of welcoming environments. So we're going to start getting into the whole biophilic thing, and which really is just natural elements and how they combine or are integrated into what you're doing. Sense of ownership, reduction of visual noise, the decluttering that has happened, and design engineering responses for the built environment really are all just supportive of student-based. Like I was saying before, environments that may inspire students, that take them somewhere else, that give them a break from the day-to-day, that get them to think forward and out of themselves, and then back in and learn in increments based upon that. And even that, I mean, it's a little butterfly. It's one idea. It's probably good for elementary school, but maybe in terms of wellness or just graphic reminders of being aware of things, or helping in a visual sense to reinforce some of these thoughts, could be part of interior design. And just saying, it's just a little jump out from that is that, obviously I'm a little bit, sided with the school building, but of course we have remote as well. And a lot of attention has been placed on schools in recent years, and now especially, to be these great places to, with professionals who have been trained, and the space itself and all the activities. Not really so much in homes, right? And then in real time versus, sort of pre-recorded, and then you tune in when you want to. And I just want to mention it because it's a real issue. It's great to talk about all of this, but what if a student doesn't have a supportive home environment, or not a stable, permanent home anyway? Then it's going to be really, really even harder for them. And I think to myself, what if somebody is physically isolated and then in virtual limbo? So they're physically isolated, the power goes out, there's no internet connection. Where are they? They're nowhere. So it's something to think about. And in terms of even the infrastructure of how to handle technological issues like that, or perhaps there are in-between spaces where students can go if it's not the school and not the home. So biophilic. So this is just another area of design that is an interesting touch point. Is kind of general design concept that I think the idea is that our primitive selves find comfort in things that remind us of the natural environment deep down, where we can take structural examples like the leaf and the cells and create actual things out of that. Or take the nautilus shell, and we have the golden rectangle over there, which is a series of squares and circles and arcs. And then all of that can be turned into design. And here's a big part of this whole world is that you create places that people enjoy to be and that they want to come back to because they feel comfortable, safe, and they have adventure coming. So again, here's just a big diagram of this has 6 different categories within it: environmental features, natural shapes and forms. So it's not just about, having green leaves everywhere. And a lot of this is intrinsic to lots of design anyway. It's just that the biophilic gives it a reference that pulls it together, which even has to do with views and vistas and just seeing interesting structural connections and mathematical relationships of parts that make you wonder and analyze and look around and think and say, wow, this is pretty interesting. It's not just a painted block wall. It's something more than that. All right, just some quick examples of the extreme, a biosphere. I don't think anybody's building a biosphere, but it's, it's important to know what the big goal is and then find a way to approximate it, right? Dream big. So I'll go through these pretty quickly. Obviously some are applicable to schools or commercial or office. And even just, if you're going to build it, if you're going to build some parapets, make them exciting. I take the opportunity to even just use some color or mosaic, or use a really cool floor tile instead of just the same beige, something. Interesting ideas, right? And that corridors are not necessarily tunnels to get from A to B, but they're a space in between other spaces. Even just, undulating forms in a roof, etc., etc. That'd be an interesting classroom. Ceiling and translucence, and maybe just as simple as a wall covering, if that's all we can do, right? All right, so moving forward. So here's where we were. Again, by the end of 2019, we had kind of these types of relationships of guide versus dictate, et cetera. Things are opening up. Kids are a little more flex. This is the idea that the pluralism of learning opportunities and experiences plus spatial opportunities led to this nice broad experience, this full experience at school. And whether that was complemented by and supplemented by virtual and distance learning. Good. Quickly go through, this is obviously one of the original notes and it's a lot going on, but I just wanted to say, from a school's point of view, here are things that are being dealt with. Here's the goal of reaching students, preparing, celebrating, and supporting them for lifelong learning. And that a lot of students want to engage, no one wants to be alone. And that it leads to college, workplace, all the things, being a good citizen, contribution, future generations. This is all linked. This is a longer term plan, ways of getting there, things you have to deal with. We still have to deal with building codes and guidelines and health department budgets. Yes, we do. And from the student, obviously different, again, this is like a recap a little bit. Different homes, cultures, families, minds, abilities, learning styles, personalities, to hopefully get them self-aware and moving forward and including others. Question out loud. I don't know, it could be bad. It depends on the situation, the 6-foot social distancing or 6-foot spatial distancing as was recommended last time. And I think at the end of the day, there's still compartmentalized time, still small space time, big expansion time. Even now is a good example is if people have their, students have to wear masks all day and then they get a mask break in another type of space that you can do that. It's all part of it, all is integrated into kind of this mindful balance of experiences that are part of a day in the life of a student at school. And community, here it is vertically, it's part of everything. You have to get the community involved for all of these decisions to make sense to everyone in the community. And then, students are dealing with this all the time, right? So the colors kind of go together. Social skills, connections, and communication is a whole area that they're juggling with everything else, their own abilities, their ability to focus, the speed and pace at which things are traveling, etc. A couple little examples of, 1950s probably, a new idea of what that might be. What was just an 8-foot high double loaded corridor, and the introduction of color and a sense of activity in and out, some interest, some intrigue, kind of a space to come to a destination type space within a school that didn't exist before, that has walls and things that are operable and can be flexed and changed, has views out. Another layer, reinterpreting the library as a center of multiple spaces with in and out connection to virtual and actual outdoors, etc. The Spanish Steps, why not, right? But in terms of gathering and a sense of place within the built environment, to sponsor gathering and sponsor spontaneous impromptu events. We're really moving along pretty well there in 2019 into 2020. One more quote here. I think it's just interesting from Einstein as well is, logic is great. That'll get you from A to B, but, imagination is really what you need to go somewhere beyond. I think this is an important thing to think about. So here we go. Here comes 2020, right? The challenge to everything. So we were moving along pretty well here. And then all of a sudden, here's the stop sign. And I called it a momentary COVID freefall. I mean, I think we all hope it's really temporary. And it really has happened, and I think we're pulling out of it. And I think it's good to be cautious, and we still are learning. We all know that. But it's kind of a throwback to the 50s, and right, all of a sudden, here we are again, facing one direction in ordinated rows. What do we do? It's just absolutely an emotional moment to think about a lot of, at least initially, that this abrupt isolation and fragmentation of students and teachers. And I remember walking a building sometime in May and just all the calendars are still in March, of course, because no one had been there, right? It was just abandoned. We're still recovering from some of these things and day-to-day updates and all this stuff. And we've all been dealing with this within just in the last few months. So just, these moments of trying to figure out what to do with guidelines and what's really spacing and distancing and how do you do that and how do you plan for that and what are we getting from government agencies in terms of how to look at that. I If you kind of look up here, here's your standard 800 square foot rooms, and we were moving right along, you know, in the traditional sense. In the middle here, maybe that had been broken up a little bit more as a kind of a 21st century, different types of spaces. We still have the same number of kids because the kids are the numbers, the 25s, broken into smaller groups. And now we have 14 people of students and staff because we have to deal with distancing. So it's interesting. I mean, a general rule of thumb was 50%, which is good and conservative. And depending on the room and the size of the room, the proportion and how 6 foot laid out, maybe you could have a few more than 50%. But again, that's a case by case basis. So moving forward, right, throughout all this, so we're going to start pulling out schools as community centers. Obviously, even during the shutdown, schools were operating to provide shelter. And we all know this, nutritional lunches, and emergency shelter for those equipped to do so. And again, you know, a little bit of sunshine through all this. One thing I think we learned, and I definitely saw it going through putting the desks together for the opening of school, is decluttering. Lots and lots of extra tables, files, just stuff, just gone. So I think that's an opportunity to build upon and get the most out of your open space. And as we move forward, maybe think about mobile storage rather than built in. As much open floor space as you can get, try to keep it. And maybe a program of storage, like of things, as we have even within the school, we might not need as much stuff. So think of a program for how that storage works. Do you have a long-term storage somewhere in the building or in the district? And then when you need that for a particular time of year, you go get it. Or teachers and programs have collaborative storage where it moves around, not one for each, but one for 4 or 5, and they just share it. Just things to think about. Of course, we all know anything's possible with unlimited resources, but we don't have that. So I think that's part of the mission here too, is to look at what we have and try to get the most potential out of it. And maybe we can influence the requirements as we go. Maybe we can have the conversations about how capacity of a school influences funding streams. Maybe we can help that out. Keep it simple. We don't have to go crazy, but keep it simple, but it's a good conversation to have. I thought that was, I'll leave this up for a second. I mean, this hit social media back in April, and I think it's just important to show that the sense of progression of how people reacted to this, dealt with it, coped with it, and hopefully move through it. And I think indicators are most people are pulling out of it, but we have to be cautious, but we have to plan, I think, to move forward. I think we're past that. Again, another quote from Maya Angelou: "We may encounter many defeats, but we must not be defeated." So, hey, you know, let's go. Let's take this opportunity and move forward. And there we are. This moment is a long-term planning opportunity. So here we are. We're moving forward. Update on Jeremy and Asher. This was in September. Still haven't met Asher, but they're doing well down in Texas. And, you know, let's move forward. Let's move forward. Let's take, we're 2020 to 2025. Let's look at that period of time and say, hey, what can we plan, you know, Asher in 25 years from now, you know, what's his school going to be like? So let's gather up the community, adapt, connect, move forward, rebalance what we've got going on. And we're all doing this anyway. We're trying to figure this out. It's a good baseline that looking at zoning and all these different complementary or conflicting quantities in this list. But, you know, just remember, you know, you can take 3 known little bubbles of color on the left and turn them into 6 different things by combining them in different ways. Again, back to exploring, not forgetting what you had, but making more out of it or reinventing it as you move forward. And I think one way to look at schools that I think we all would like is that, you know, schools are things in the old way of looking at them. They're nouns. They're just kind of hanging out. But learning is a verb, so why can't buildings act like that? So we get into this whole idea of flex. How can a school be flexible? Well, it can be flexible physically, operable partitions or pulling things or moving furniture around to create different spaces. It can be flexible in time and how it's scheduled. So there are different ways, time and space, to help with that. So just think about things, known things differently. We don't have to reinvent everything. We just have to rethink. Which brings us to some new and existing school building design after 2020. I will say it's an emphasis on existing because there are so many existing assets there that we can adapt bit by bit and see how we can do that, but important to understand what new could be as well. So as we go to progression forward to next millennium, forgive me for a moment. How do we move forward from 1900? 2100 seems like a really odd number, you know, it's 80 years away. It's not the next millennium, of course, but sure feels like it. And I think that we're at such an exponential rate of development at this point. I think it's an interesting way to look at it. Community of place. So we have this ongoing discussion too of you know, how much percentage of time are students in person in the school. And I think it's an ongoing discussion. I think we had a lot, most of our survey thought 100%, but some thought 50-50 might work. And others expressed they're not sure. We don't really know if the 50, what the effects of 50-50 are. We don't know the long-term effects of things. We don't, we're learning that. But all these different ways of having things going on, as I say, you can be virtual even in school, obviously. Distance learning is not new, and school to school can connect, and perhaps we can adapt spaces within existing schools to be more about virtual with others. So, you know what I mean? It's not just virtual or in person, they go together. And elsewhere, what other places, you know? Are you going to school for part of the time at your parents' workplace or in a public library, or, you know, unfortunately in limbo, like I said before, that's not the best idea, but some people might be forced. Some students have no choice sometimes but that, or whether it's an issue with the house or whether you're in a rural area that has no connectivity, there can be issues with that. So that all has to continue to be developed. I put this in almost as editorial. It kind of frightens me to think of the anonymity of this. And at such a young age, being fascinated with the phone. So I just put that in kind of as a gesture. I don't think it's a place that we want to go. And again, you know, Dalai Lama, in terms of, you know, it's great, we're educating, but let's not forget all the other stuff, right? It's very prevalent that we're trying to talk about compassion and empathy for others. So let's start jumping into some thoughts for getting away from all that, talk about some design. So a design pivot here, I drew here, just imagine there's a building with a connecting corridor. And that's all there is, it's just a connecting corridor, nothing more. So let's try to see what potential it could have. So if you look at that, here's my corridor over here. Bumped out a little piece, added a little piece out here, and started to try to create something more. Some biophilic elements. Here's a sun made out of metal. Here's some interesting imagery painted on a wall, a real flower, that kind of cool beach, and some other things. A yurt, right? A yurt, kind of a simple old form from a kind of primordial moment. And there's something about it. It's kind of comforting. So could that be used as a design element? Just something simple like that, a simple shape. And how do you integrate that in and make more out of something by just embellishing it a little bit? So if we look at that structure, we really have, on the inside, we have different areas where people can gather. And then we have implied outdoor areas based on what we've created. And then an extension out into the landscape. You know, if this is ideally, you know, on a beach and there are trails in the woods, just use all of that as part of the experience of the school day. And that there are, you know, many different ways of combining different groups to learn, to get together, to observe ideas of natural forms and to the patterns of how it's designed. So this is actually an outdoor space here, and this could be an indoor space for learning. Just a little example. Another recap sheet in terms of, you know, here were ways, right? Again, summarizing quickly, some of the negatives of the past that, you know, egg crates or warehousing of students in schools, you just don't want to do that. And that we do have a history. We have the history of buildings, older buildings that we need to address. And that some positives are, you know, can you think of schools being a little more open and flexible. That doesn't mean wide open with open plan. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you still have to deal with acoustics control, egress, fire codes, all of that. It's just an assemblage of spaces rather than a repetition of cubicles that we can expand internally. And that, it's so important that the physical environment allows for the unsaid, unintended spontaneity of meetings, or something just happening just because it happened. Relief from home, new discoveries and places to explore. We all need a break from everyday moment. Even getting up and just taking a mental break every now and then can really help you retain information, be excited to come back and learn more. Asking questions, learning from each other, and that the new reference is varying variation. I mean, as a fun term in a way, and it's not elimination of dynamic change or risk, but it's the mitigation thereof that's ongoing. We're doing the best we can and managing change. So here are a couple diagrams, very generalized. So if this was a 1950 classroom that had 24 students in it, kind of like that, right? That's our reference point. And maybe those same 24 students looked something like that. So here's kind of a furniture moment and zoning of the room moment. And life was pretty good. We had some interesting things going on, different types of activities and learning and in groups, etc. And then we went from 24 down to 11 students, socially distanced with a teacher. And I'm just going to say, every time you add another faculty member in here, you're going to lose another student, right? We all know that, because now with distancing, it's a matter of occupancy of people, right? So if you have 3 staff members, then they can't be students, right? So it just goes like that. So trying to work this back up to more students, imagine along the back wall here, if you had some clear partitions, and you can't lean back if you're up against the back walls, you can't really breathe on your neighbor, but maybe that's a way to get some more students in without the need for distancing, right? Because distancing is one way, the 6 feet. The partitions is another, and obviously the masks in general allow more free movement. It's just that you have to have the mask on. This talks about an area where there may be some masks in a limited amount, and then more people either distant or using partitions. We're up to 17 students. In this iteration, we get up to 18. We get up to 18 also, but we probably have some mask wearing issues in the center area. We get back up to 21, right? And then eventually, hopefully, at some point soon, we can get back to where we were and get all the students back in one way or another. So that's that. Another kind of departure here, a landscape painting by an artist that you may or may not know. And I just want to talk about the global view of, or even just the basics of a landscape. And as over time, this artist developed their sense of landscape and got a little more specific into where they were heading and reinterpreting. So I don't know if you know the artist, but it is Pablo Picasso, which is interesting. I don't know if everybody knew that he did landscapes in the beginning, but here's our landscape. In planning, it's not a lot of fun, right? It's just a lot of information, but we kind of have to start. This is an entire school district, how it's laid out, who's where, what the programs are, right? And then an idea of how to change it. So as we move forward in long-term planning and we want to group or use buildings differently, this is one way to do it. Start at the top and work down to the individual building. So this had that chart. This took a look at where those buildings were, right? And who was there and what neighborhoods were affected. And eventually it led us to a building. And in a particular case, we found we had 11 classrooms available. So with those 11 rooms, maybe we could look at this bottom diagram here, and maybe we'd go back into this building and start breaking up some of the boxes and start doing more of this. So we haven't moved forward that yet, but it's just an example of how to approach planning. This case, here's one of those 1920s-esque multi-story buildings with a couple one-story additions over time. And I just wanted to point out how, different things on different floors, and just from the time it's a series of boxes, and how we can kind of look at how many students and start to think about, in this case, expanding it a little bit to then reshuffle things around, rethink about what we're doing, combining lots of different activities so that they can cross-pollinate, and eventually think of the building in a completely different way, by groupings, by travel, by connection, eliminating dead ends, and even zoning the building. If you need to have separate groups and separate places, you could do it. Idea of a middle school, some older rooms, and lots of lots of kind of HVAC ducts and all kinds of things going on in this older building, things that we deal with. Opening that up, combining it, taking a look at how that could be a very interesting space for students to come and do different things. This is how it looked before COVID as a thought, and that could be reshuffled to look like this with some partitions and some distancing. And then maybe that looked like this, another version of that, and how that version could be changed to reflect today's moment and still be used. So here's a sense of a high school existing, a concept, a little more of a drawing of where it might go, but I'm going to put the diagrams on the bottom to really help out say what I'm saying. So you can definitely see in the existing that this is just a series of boxes next to boxes next to boxes that were added over time. The concept is trying to create a connecting piece, a shared common space for students that then allows for a multitude of different size spaces and activities to occupy along it and be an activated space, and also kind of break apart the old knowledge of a cafeteria or kitchen, or library, and break it into smaller spaces and create kind of a space within the block of the rest of the building. And then here actually more developed in terms of a variety of different types of spaces for different types of groups of students, different types of activities, sometimes on their own, sometimes with instructors, etc. I probably need to pick up the pace, so I'm going to go a little faster. Another quote and another beach scene. This, again, an exploration of creating a high school based on project-based learning that started with some like high bay spaces that had garage doors on both sides for art and tech projects that could cross over an outdoor space and go to the next house next door, and just different types of collaborative, intercollaborative spaces between different houses of students, and how to create public and private zones, and how to restructure how this school could work, and how it had this kind of central commons that had fragments of what used to be a library and a cafeteria spread throughout. And it might be an interesting way to approach things moving forward, that things are more spread out into different sort of zones than just monolithic one note, and that can help the flexibility too of use. An idea of a landscape approach to an elementary school. So not even doing anything inside. How about a master plan for orchards, farming, outdoor classrooms, lots of opportunities to be outside, accessible sidewalks to everything, apple trees, fitness, farms, sheds, community involvement, literal places to have classrooms, although the whole site is now a classroom, and then just the garden areas in general. So some takeaways, I'm going to run through this pretty fast. These are things we're all dealing with. They're just values, lots of continuity, expansion, contraction. So things are ebbing and flowing even conceptually, and we want to get the buildings to start to do that. What we've learned, we know there are conflicts coming, and there's going to have to be some prioritization. Depending on all these different ideas don't always go well together, but that is the process of figuring out how to get them to go together. What we continue to explore, what we can. Value, available resources, community support. An awful lot has already been invested. We want to kind of work with the assets that have been created, move forward with them, adapt them, thoughts of zones in school, community outreach, continuing role of the school, humanization of technology, which is ongoing, right? And just find ways to keep using it, but in a social context as well as virtual. Cohorts, groups of students that would stay together for safety reasons, and a little less maybe intermingling to try in these times. The pluralism of experience, really want to try to have a well-rounded experience, and address all the different types of learners, students, thinkers, cultures, backgrounds, where everyone's coming from. And again, one of those back and forth compartment versus openness. Learning communities, basics of a health screening before cohorts staying together. Special needs students, can't forget, obviously we can break these down and have separate discussions of all this, but you got to keep everybody in mind, parent and teacher support, professional development for everybody. Hey, practical, maybe innovative, some thoughts might be a little crazy, but hey, at the moment, let's not be afraid to ask the questions. Long-term, don't get too COVID-19 specific, because what if something different happens 10 years from now? I don't know, at some point. Next Millennium Design, we'll get to that. Very quickly, I'll try to go through these, but we know the nurses' health suite's going to change. We want to maybe have more parent involvement, or more of a place to quarantine and hold if necessary. Guidance and student support, including parents in that. German classrooms will start to become, rather than their traditional kind of one note or a couple subjects, really they're trying to do everything. They're really trying to be flexible and do other things. Specialized classrooms that once were just dedicated may start to blend into the classrooms. Think of learning studios. Moving towards teacher collaborative centers. Teachers need places to go and collaborate and support each other. And students can participate in that as well. That teacher and family professional development, especially family as teaching. Think about this, the family version of that. And broadcast areas for both teachers and students. I mentioned that picture of a TV studio. Maybe there's a little more of that going on that goes back and forth, when somebody's not in the building, even if they are in the building, to kind of keep that, what we've learned that is useful for that. A couple more of these. Music rooms, it would be great if they didn't have sloped floors, because we can use them for more. Libraries, I think they may be disappearing over time and kind of being absorbed into zones of the building. Gyms, obviously need these for athletics. Some of the older buildings where the gymnasiums are too small, maybe they can become a stackable space or compartmentalized, or I'm going to introduce in a minute the idea of a learning theater. Cafeterias, same idea as libraries, to spread them out. Hallways, instead of being tunnels, they're spaces that connect other spaces. Make use of courtyards and outdoor classrooms. Continue, the community needs to be involved and use the community asset, the computer, this schools are community assets and resources. And that we know off campus there can be learning. There had been learning off campus before, so keep working on that. Right, covered outdoor lobbies. The whole idea now of drop off and dismissal has really changed. So, this is out there, but I mean, can we learn from airports and other terminals, right? Really think about that. There's space, they're safe spaces, but they're structured as well. Obviously, fresh air, real air when you can bring it in and the weather's correct. If not, obviously, we have to make sure that mechanical fresh air is what it needs to be. And then develop the individual learning space that may or may not be in the school building. But bring with that all the lessons learned from the design of the school building. All right, some more big ideas. So just an example, I've got 3 of the same square footage box. I've got 4 rooms in the upper left. We started modifying this to be a little more interesting and smaller breakout spaces. And then even further, the idea is that in terms of, and this is just a generic thought, but these 4 rooms really count within guidelines for a connection to funding. So there could be 96 students here and they all generate funding. Because we start to break up these rooms into smaller spaces than what's considered a baseline, we start to lose some funding. And as we get even more creative here, we lose even more. So the point is, it's just not very encouraging to not do this from a financial point of view. So here's a conflict of education, planning, and funding, which I think we all know, and I think we'd all like to have the further dialogue on the development of this and see if we can help the funding spread out further. Here's a quick one. So on the left, this would be, you know, if we're going to traditionally draw a 2-story classroom wing, we'd start with a hallway, we'd put stairwells in, and we start to load up boxes of classrooms. That's the traditional way. Whereas if we start with the outside, put in some structure, put in our elements, and really think of it as more dynamic, moving, flexible, we get a very different type of space out of the same amount of footage nearly. So that you have the traditional and potentially new. We have some kind of fun renderings of what that would be, typical, right? And what it could be, potentially. Obviously, this is more of a secondary environment, but you see all the different possibilities, all different types of places to go for students and teachers, or teachers and teachers, and that it's flexible, and the building lends itself to being modified and changed by the users. Here's another idea, big box store. You know, we have a lot of empty big box stores. This started happening before COVID. Can we do something with those? I mean, could those become, you know, educational type spaces that maybe span across districts? Can they be used? Can they have compartmentalized spaces? If a student, maybe that student that was isolated in limbo at home could come here, right? They have their own space, they're protected, they're safe, and they have places to go in between and have activities with others, and faculty can come here. Here's just one way of looking at it. You can start to cut holes in that building, or you could just think of it as just a series of open columns with events and rooms and things in it. Maybe some ideas starting very basic of how that type of space could be developed, you know, 3-dimensionally into some pretty cool spaces as the stores are gone, and even the entry in the sense of covered entry coming in. Okay, I see I've hit an hour, so I'm gonna keep moving. Here's another idea, the vertical school. Is this one of the crazy ones? I don't know. What about an opera house, right? Here's an opera house, and it's a series of like box seats, all individual. So if a student was in each one of those, they'd be in their own distance space, and they could look vertically and look down on a performance area. You can get a lot more students in it. Maybe this is one of those older gym or two-story spaces that you can't really use. Maybe it's just another way to look at it. Maybe the warehouse turns into something like that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. Here's some sketches from 30 years ago in Vicenza this is a Palladio building for the architects in the room, where there was a false perspective built in the back of the stage, virtual space that they literally built to make it look like it was really a long street. Obviously, today we don't have to do all of that. We have video walls, right? We can do video walls and have virtual everywhere. Imagine if you had a room, it just becomes non-physical anymore because it's just all virtual with screens. Maybe this is somewhere we're going. Make sure if you do that, don't forget, you have to have enough power, you have to have connectivity, you have to have a roof that doesn't leak, etc. Okay. Covered outdoor areas, right? We have this. And then just for some levity, I mean, really, every student can have an umbrella too. It might be interesting, just saying. Build sustainably, right? Not a new idea, but as we move into needing to be really efficient with our resources and pushing forward with HVAC requirements, I'm just going to forward that up, is that you have, I can't do that. But if you see all of this, here are ways to design sustainably. This is not new, but as we keep thinking about this, we can get even more out of the physical asset and energy, and think about that you need energy. What if the power grid goes out and you're reliant on technology? We have to have backup and generators and maybe ways to get energy somehow else. Just a thought, virtual swing space, we didn't really have it before so much. We have it now. So if you really need to do something, maybe no one's in the building for a period of time. Now, don't forget the basics. This is important. These are all things we really have to remember as we dream things out. We have codes and funding, capacity, aging buildings. We want to include the community and everything. We want to do long-term planning. We have opportunities and limitations. And at the center of all of this, of course, is student-based learning to tie it all together. And that we want to balance out practical with extraordinary, And here's some ideas of what those qualities could be. And it's shared that awareness, not fear. It's good. We know what we've learned. We know what we have to do. Let's keep it moving. Long-term value always in mind. And what is adapting, coming to the end here. Learn from each other. We have a lot to offer each other. Let's cross boundaries. Let's work together, pull people together. Let's introduce a team to plan and a process to follow that we can think in ideal terms and then take action with practical solutions and involve the community in the process. And that, I just wanted to mention, I also, it's important for us all to know, schools in some ways are really undeserving targets of scrutiny because a lot is going on outside of the school day that the school has no control over. And, let's end this. And maybe we can just, get students to be the ambassadors back to their social networks and families, et cetera. To the end, so summary, next Millennium design is really the whole presentation. There's not much more to add. It's trying to be the best of what we had and a reaction to what happened, but then a long-term plan to move forward that, if we can start sooner than later in the planning does take a little bit of time, doesn't happen overnight, and take the opportunity to connect, use our shared resources. Imagination is more important than knowledge, right? So let's get inventive and collaborative as always. And here we are, maybe the next couple of years, we really sit and plan and then we move forward. So with that, I'm a little over, but I think we're good. So that's the presentation.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for that great presentation.
Thank you for the opportunity.
It was really informative, and you really share a lot of your knowledge with us about school planning and design, particularly schools here in Long Island. We would like to invite everyone to ask any questions. If you want to talk to Kevin, just send your question through the Q&A. We still have about 10 minutes, so feel free to send any questions. Looks like we have something. Okay, we have a question here. Due to the pandemic, we have learned that private sector office personnel were able to work remotely and still do, as well as teachers and administrative staff. If this is potentially the new norm, what happens to all the vacant office buildings and schools, and more important, the future of architecture, engineering, and construction, all trades? Currently, it appears a lot of New Yorkers are leaving the city, wondering what New York City and other large cities will look like in years to come. That's a great question.
Yeah, so in terms of the city, right, it's another animal. I think back to a lot of the office space and fused with education. Obviously, education has a connection in terms of the place, mostly with, again, where people live, a little more immediate in terms of the suburbs, I guess, just back to here. I don't know if that's answering the question, but I think if space is vacated, we also don't know the short term and long term of that. Obviously, the city has an economic issue and a lot of other issues in terms of being there at the moment. And I think out here, as I was saying with the big box stores, it's interesting to think that if office space has opened up, maybe there are opportunities for schools to use that, or for families to use that, or an in-between space for certain students if they don't have a place to be in the school for a period of time. I also would stress that I think for students, and I think most would agree that especially for elementary students, there's a real push to be in person in schools. So I would imagine, they're going to take up the space that the schools have first, and probably really need that more than the virtual component. So I think that's a constant. And as people are working, they're probably more able at that point to be remote as adults and having gone through the system and socializing and growing with others. So I think it's more of an opinion than an answer, but that's the reaction.
Thank you.
Probably no right answer, right?
We have another question. How long would it take to plan, draw, get funding and approvals, build, and then occupy a new building or a major renovation?
Well, that's variable. So I think depending on the complexity of the project. So if you just imagine, so for those who aren't in the school industry in New York, you'd probably say that the planning process, especially if you want to involve the community, could be a year, whatever it takes. It could be less, it could be more. Then actually drawing the building once consensus is reached and getting approvals could be another year. And then on from there, construction, good reference point is probably 2 years or more, depending on phasing. So you're looking at multiple years from the time you start the process for sure. Probably at least 3 and on in order to have an end result. And if it's smaller scale projects or more infrastructure related, that can be a little bit more on an annual or a year and a half or up to 2 year basis. So that's a little bit more attainable in time as opposed to a new building or a major spatial renovation.
We have another question here. As we all know, the school facilities are inspected regularly and most construction has been more health and safety related, desired reconstruction and other ones needed by school.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
I think it's more than a comment than a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, so in terms of the infrastructure, so you want to make sure, I think that obviously a lot of focus on HVAC and air systems right now, and fresh air in particular, and the circulation of air. And that has been ongoing. Districts have really been addressing that for many, many years now, especially in the older buildings. So I think most are in pretty good shape with that. But depending on how spaces are being used, right, it depends on if there's more to do. So if a room was never used, you know, for occupancy of students, then it might want to be looked at, you know, again, if it's newly used again. But at the moment, there's probably not much of that going on because there are less people using the buildings.
I think that's all the questions we had so far. There is a part 2 of that question.
Okay.
At what point in time do you believe all schools will be replaced and redesigned for the next phase of learning?
Well, that's a big question, right? I don't know if I have an answer for that. If you'd almost have to say, well, for instance, if everyone decided that they wanted new buildings, you know, and could somehow financially achieve that, which I don't think will happen, right? It would be years, right? As I was saying before, you're looking at, you know, within a 5-year window of, that's in the extreme example, you're going to take every building down and put up a new one, right? It's years, it's many, many years. Wouldn't happen overnight. But in terms of adapting, which I think is what we would say, I think it's the same time period. You'd probably just go in bits and pieces and you'd have to balance out the occupancy of the spaces versus the magnitude of what you're trying to do or accomplish. And as I was saying earlier, I mean, a lot of different buildings are from different eras and they're in a different starting position than others to be adapted. So I think it's a case by case basis, school by school.
Thank you, Kevin. I think we don't have any more open questions. So maybe we have 5 more minutes. Maybe you would like to announce, Tony, the next event. And thank you so much, Kevin, again, for this session. It was great.
Okay, thank you, Graciela, and thank you, Kevin. First, a very special thank you to our speaker, Kevin Walsh, for an excellent and very comprehensive presentation. You certainly gave us a lot to think about. I also want to thank Nicole O'Donnell, our sign interpreter. I'd like to thank the Nassau BOCES District Superintendent, Dr. Robert Dillon, for sharing his opening remarks, as well as the Nassau BOCES Board and our Communications Office for all of their support. Thank you to our co-host, AIA Long Island, and to Graciela Carrillo, as well as the entire AIA staff for all of their efforts and assistance in helping to develop this webinar series. Lastly, I would especially like to thank all of you for joining us in the webinar today. You all play such an important role in this conversation, and we really look forward to your continued input and your feedback. So as I mentioned earlier, I'd like to share my screen and provide everyone with information you'll need to participate in the virtual thought exchange. So let me do that right now. Okay. Hopefully everyone sees that.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to leave that information up on my screen until the end of this session. So you can join this conversation by taking a picture with your smartphone of that QR code that's located on the left side of your screen. Or you can join by logging into the website, which is just to the right of the QR code, www.tejoin.com, and just enter that 9-digit code that's listed below that website. You can also join by responding to the link previously sent when you registered for the event. So in addition to completing the thought exchange, we would encourage you to please take a few minutes and rate the responses provided by others. Again, your feedback will give us great insight into the direction we're moving forward in school design. So we really do want to hear from you. So the thought exchange is going to remain open until 5:00 p.m. this Friday. You can view the final results of the thought exchange as well as a recording of the first 2 webinars on our homepage of the Nassau BOCES website, and that's at www.nassauboces.org. Our website is noted at the bottom of that screen. We also plan to get this information to all of you in a follow-up email. So I'm going to unshare my screen right now. Hopefully you got everything that you need from there. Okay. So finally, I'd just like to take the opportunity to invite all of you back again for the final webinar in the 3-part series. It's scheduled 2 weeks from today on October 28th from 12 noon to 1:30. That webinar is titled Transforming School Design for a Post-COVID World, Learning Spaces for Creativity and Collaboration. So please mark your calendars. We'll send out a program announcement by the end of this week. Thanks again to all of you, and be well. Hope to see you soon. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.